Welcome to everyone joining us for October's ECR Wednesday webinar, hosted by eLife, the series that aims to give early career research to discuss issues important to you and your research career. My name's Emma. I work for the eLife Features team, and today our panelists will share their insights into the funding challenges faced by early career researchers and the pros and cons of funding caps. The webinar will begin with the panelists sharing their stories. Then, in the second half of the webinar, we'll be putting your questions to them. To ask a question, you can type in the question box on the GoToWebinar Functions panel, or you can tweet us, we are at eLife Community, using the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Please also join us on Twitter immediately after the webinar, where we'll be continuing discussion under the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Finally, I'd just like to let you know that we are recording the webinar, and it will make it available on YouTube in the near future. Now I'll pass over to Vinod to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Emma. I'm Vinod Ilangovan. I'm from the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry in Göttingen, which is in Germany. And I'm also part of the eLife Early Career Advisory Group, or ECAG. So my personal motivation to join ECAG was to support responsible behaviors in science, which is what eLife stands for. And as you could see, the mission of eLife is to support good science, which is basically supporting responsible behaviors in science and not looking at the impact, but to look at the discovery, which is Randy Sheckman, the founder, quoted that the impact that we cherish is about discovery. And today we are going to talk about the crisis of funding for early career researchers, specifically focusing on the funding situation in the US, where there was a recent cap that was announced by the National Institute of Health, which is one of the major funders for biomedical research. As we all know that research funding is the basis for the research that we do. And we are going to discuss about what are the challenges that are ahead of us early career researchers and also early mid-career researchers towards research funding. So I'm very happy to introduce the panelists who have joined us today. Casey Green, he's from the Perelman School of Medicine. He's an assistant professor who's very vocal about the funding cap. And he runs a lab which is not funded by the NIH, which gives him freedom to talk about that. And we also have Nidhi Bala from the UC Santa Cruz. She's an associate professor, and she's also very vocal about funding cap, the grant support index. And we also have a senior professor, Mark Peiffer, from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he was very proactively writing articles about in support of funding cap. And here's a small slide showing how early career researchers get less and less funded, or more senior researchers get more funded by the NIH. Where you could see that there's a decline from the mid-career researchers and the early career researchers, which is shown in the green and red, while the late or the established researchers who are more than 60 years of age, they have enough amount of funding, or the funding has been increasing for them. And with this, let's start a poll on whether we have a poll question for the audience, looking at if you are supporting a funding cap or if you're against the funding cap. So if you could quickly poll in, and we'll hopefully see the results, which most of the audience are interested in supporting a funding cap, which the panelists will be happy to discuss now. Now I'd like to invite my first guest, Casey Green, to talk about why he's interested in supporting the funding cap, being an early career researcher, and yeah, he'll tell us about his views on this.
Yeah, so I guess I should introduce myself. So I'm Casey Green. I'm a computational biologist at the Perelman School of Medicine at UPenn in the Department of Pharmacology. I don't know that I would necessarily say I'm in favor of a funding cap, I would say I think it's a little bit nuanced. And I think maybe caps on certain types of funding would be helpful. But just to give you the early career researcher perspective, so I was at a different university for 3 years before I moved to Penn. So I'm in my 6th year overall, and as Vinod mentioned, I'm fortunate to have substantial funding from foundations as well as a grant from the NSF. But even though I've written a lot of NIH grants, I haven't actually gotten any yet. So I still remain independent of the NIH funding stream at this moment. I think what I've seen is that a lot of grants score reasonably, but kind of none have gotten over that funding line. And from my own reviews and from talking to colleagues, what we've seen is sort of an emphasis against risk at some during review. And we've noticed comments that even though you're not supposed to sort of ding an early stage or new investigator for that status, there are sometimes comments either against comments that note sort of the higher risk of research in an ECR lab, or lower risk of research in a senior lab. So like comments where you see so-and-so has been running project X for 15 years. None of the early career researchers are ever going to get that positive comment. And so I'm worried that kind of without strong policies that support a healthy workforce, the NIH is going to lose some of the potential long-term benefits of having a broad-based biomedical workforce. And I asked a couple colleagues to share their stories too. So it's not just me. I have a colleague whose name I've changed, let's say Jill, who's a 3rd-year tenure track faculty member at an R1 university. She's written 5 unique R01s, 9 total applications. 8 of 9 have actually been discussed. 2 of 9 have scored below the 25th percentile. So, one of the NHGRI, the ESI policies that was announced intended to score all ESIs that had applications under that 25th percentile, and for her, that would have been critical. Eventually, right before council, the NIH changed that policy, and so her grant actually wasn't funded on the A0, so the 20th percentile grant, and then the A1 ended up scoring worse. So, she's basically in a similar situation. She's received foundation funding, but she basically has 3 more years to get an R01 or other large federal grant, or she won't get tenure, and so she'll be out of the workforce. And I think, we could end up a lot poorer if people like this leave. It's worth noting that 15 years ago or during the stimulus package era, a lot of people would have been funded with their current scores, and many of the senior faculty who support or who oppose the cap, could have had their first grants funded with worse scores than a lot of early stage investigators are getting now. And it's hard to quantify the extent to which good reviews come due to reputation, but I think there's an element to that as well that she's noted. So just to wrap up, I think there's a great quote from Vannevar Bush that he wrote in Science, the Endless Frontier in 1945, which he said, "If we were all knowing and all wise, we might, but we think probably not, write you a plan whereby there might be selected for training, which they otherwise would not get, those who 20 years hence would be scientific leaders, and we might not bother about any lesser manifestations of scientific ability. But in the present state of knowledge, a plan cannot be made which will select and assist only those young men and women who will give the top future leadership to science." And I think this is true in science, right? We don't know what's going to work out, so we should place lots of bets. And I think some of the cap proposals that have come out and some of the sort of policies that try to weight things in favor of building a broader, more healthy biomedical workforce, I think recognize this. And then I think if we don't, we'll be poorer for it in 10 or 15 years.
Okay. Thank you, Casey. Now I'd like to ask Nidhi Balan to say her views on how it affects the mid-career people, because she's an associate professor, and she'll be able to tell us more on how mid-career people are also affected by not having funding cap.
What's up, y'all? I am tenured and I recently got my renewal funded, so I'm NIH funded through NIGMS. No, whoop! I think my big concerns are the effect on early career researchers, and I think Casey did a really, really nice job highlighting some of the concerns that early career researchers are having right now about getting NIH funding. Mid-career researchers, because if you look at that graph, not only is there a drop-off in early career researchers at the expense of the more established investigators, there's a drop-off in the mid-career researchers, and they're not experiencing any additional support from the NIH in terms of how their grants are reviewed in study section as opposed to early career researchers. So what I'm seeing in a lot of institutions is that people will often get their first NIH grant after a long time trying, but then the big hurdle becomes getting their first renewal or their second renewal because they're in that in-between stage where they're not getting an early career bump, but they're also not gaining the level of reputation that established investigators might be getting in study section. My other major concern is that what this does to the diversity of the biomedical workforce. I think that when you have a hyper-competitive environment where there is potentially the benefit of the doubt given to some researchers and the benefit of the doubt not given to other researchers, that this puts a severe strain on who gets supported by the NIH and faculty and the diversity of NIH-funded investigators. There's a lot of data that suggests that people of color, specifically women of color, and white women experience some level of bias during NIH funding, and so that they often are less likely to get funded by the NIH. And so I'm really worried about what this means for who will be making up our faculty, not only in the context of the youth of the faculty, but the gender and racial and ethnic makeup of the faculty that as we continue forward in the biomedical workforce.
Thank you very much, Nidhi, for talking about diversity. Now, I'd like to ask Mark Peiffer to comment on his open support towards funding cap.
Okay, so again, just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Peiffer. I'm a professor in the biology department. I've run a NIH-funded lab here for 26 years. The full disclosure, right, I had 2 NIH grants, which by many standards are small, and I converted them into one of the new NIGMS mirror grants about a year ago. I have about $425,000 in funding. I've also had the opportunity for the last 3 years to serve on council for one of the NIH institutes, NIGMS, and that's been a spectacular learning experience, and this taught me a lot. NIH has allowed the U.S. to be a leader in biomedical research for the last multiple decades because of its investment policy, investing in talented young people and then allowing them not only to start their programs but continue their programs. The amount of dollars in constant terms have flattened out and in fact to some extent decreased, and that means every dollar that we have is critically important. An investment advisor, if you ask them about how to invest your dollars, and we heard this from Casey, right, diversify your investments because you don't know which investments are going to pay off. NIH's investment at this moment is not diversified. 1% of scientists get 11% of the funding and 10% get 40% of the funding. And I have seen, and I think all of us have seen the results at our own institutions, young and particularly in my place, mid-career people are having a difficult time getting grants renewed and talented people are shutting their labs down, and I think that's a crisis. We face, when we do that, the chance that we're going to fail to fund the people who are going to really make fantastically important discoveries. I know the person I was a postdoc for, right, as a young scientist would have, coming into Princeton, publishing in journals like Wilhelm Roos' Archive of Developmental Biology might not have been at the top of the list of an NIH study section, but that work ultimately resulted in the 1995 Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology. It was really important work. It's often difficult to recognize that at the start. NIGMS has done a really good job among the institutes of trying to figure out ways to broaden the funding base. They've ended a number of big science programs. They've created programs like MIRA, and the result is the success rate there is now 29.5%, much higher than in some of the other institutes. They also, along with the Office of Extramural Research, have done a lot of research, and I'd encourage people to go look for the data, right? They've very carefully looked at productivity per unit dollar, impact of science based on the amount of funding that people have, and they did an exceptionally thorough analysis of it. Other people outside of NIH have done similar things, and again, if you want to see a summary of some of this data, the November 1st issue of Molecular Biology of the Cell will carry an article that I wrote that provides you with references. All of that data showed that first, impactful science requires money. I think it's obvious to all of us, if you have no money, you can't do good science. But it also shows that at a certain level, the productivity per unit dollar starts to flatten out. That very large labs are not producing science at the same rate as smaller labs. And again, we're squeezing people out because of that. It also, as Nidhi said, tends to have a disproportionate impact both in terms of people, but also in terms of geographical regions, where certain institutions have the lion's share of the funding. NIH, as a result, announced a very bold policy, the Grant Support Index, that would have limited funding to investigators at the level of 3 R01s. That policy then was tweaked with community input, and it looked like it was moving forward. A handful of extremely well-funded investigators and their deans and other people who are the kind of people represented on the NIH director's executive group fought back against that, and the policy after 2 months was rescinded. They've replaced it with a policy that they claim will do similar things, the Next Generation Researcher Initiative. I love the idea of funding early career people. I think if you look at the graph that we were presented, what you'll find out is that NIH loves funding early career people too, at least for the last 10 years. And they put into place a number of policies that benefit them. We could probably do more, but that line for the last 10 years has been flat. The line that is dropping is the line for mid-career people, people coming in for their first, second, and third renewals, and it's dropping dramatically. The Next Generation Research Initiative has 2 major flaws. One is it has no designated source of money. As it stands, it's quite likely that they'll take money away from a lab that has 1 grant in order to fund a lab that has no grants. That will not produce a net increase in the number of researchers. The second flaw is it's limited to people with 10 years or less of NIH funding. It looks to me like what it's going to do is just accentuate the current cliff that people are facing. People will have an easier time finding funding in their initial proposal and their first renewal, and then an even more difficult time when time comes to get their second renewal. And that could be a disaster for our system. There are a number of ways we could limit funding. The GSI was just one of them. The NIGMS has a policy called the 750K policy, where anyone who has more than $750,000 in direct costs is given extra scrutiny, and it becomes more difficult then for them to get an additional grant. Tom Pollard, in a piece he wrote for the ASCB blog, suggested the possibility, as have other people, of limiting the size of labs. When a lab has 50 postdoctoral fellows, is it likely that all of those postdocs are equally productive? There are a number of ways of doing that, but I think that's essential. I'd encourage people to look at the Next Generation Researcher Initiative working group that NIH has created, because they are currently thinking about how they can change that initiative to more directly address the problems that the community is facing. Again, I think there's a wide variety of ways that early and mid-career investigators can make their views known, and they need to do that, and I'd encourage them to do so.
Thank you very much, Mark, for presenting your views on this. And now I would like to open up for questions among the panelists. If there are any questions that you have or wanted to address between each other, then I just open up this. In the meanwhile, I'll also like to tell the audience that if you want to ask questions, you could use the question panel of the GoToWebinar, or you could also use the ECR Wednesday hashtag to ask questions through Twitter. Now, if there are any questions.
I think one thing that I would definitely echo what Mark has been saying about NIGMS as a really nice model for an institute at the NIH that has implemented an unofficial cap in some ways. I would also say that my big concern with the NGRI, or whatever it's called, the NGRI, is that there is no sense of transparency about how those decisions will be made, about who gets the funding through the NGRI, and how those decisions will be made across ICs, so that institutes in the NIH, and how those decisions will be made within ICs. So will POs bring those things, will program officers, sorry, I'm very used to the lingo, will program officers bring lots of details there that are not being hammered out that really make me worry about how those things will be implemented, especially if a major concern is how are we going to address the growing diversity of the biomedical workforce, and how we're going to address who gets funded if they're not necessarily receiving the benefit of the doubt in study section. So that was more a statement than a question. I apologize.
Thank you.
I have just a quick question for both Casey and Nidhi. If you look around you, right, do you see mid-career and early career people who are struggling?
Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I think I see people in my department who are doing great work, who have done great work, but are not, you know, necessarily savvy, and are in positions where they have lost their funding, have not been renewed the second time, and have not acclimated to the new hyper-competitive environment. And I'm not certain that everyone needs to be the same when it comes to being competitive for funding in the current environment.
Yeah, I think I would agree, and I would echo. You know, the people who I see who are in the toughest position are those who got their first R01 and it's sort of ending. You know, because like Nidhi said, they're not far enough through to have, you know, the kind of benefits of reputation, but they've lost the benefits of the policies. So.
Okay, we have a question from Twitter from Millie Liani, and she asks, what plans are there to narrow down the gender gap in research funding?
I would love to know the answer to that too. I would say that one thing that I have been heartened about, but again, there's no practical, I don't know how practically this is being applied, is that the NIH recently, or maybe a year or two ago, widened their definition of diversity to include women as faculty members. And so the idea would be is that if the NIH is in a position to further or more strongly support certain demographics, that women in faculty positions, and therefore women who are competitive for NIH funds, would be receiving some level of additional support. I don't know that people have actually been using that. I have been arguing that women should, in discussing with their POs or their program officers, should use that as an argument to their program officers, that their program officers should advocate for their grants, especially if their grants are on borderline scores. But I have no data for how effective that is. I have no data on whether or not that's being implemented practically across ICs, within ICs, with POs. And so as far as I know, there is, I know of no strict policies that are directly addressing the gender gap. And I would also like to point out that that gender gap for a lot of women of color is at the intersection of their race. So even in some cases where white women are doing better, so for new investigators, white women are often doing equally as well as white men in getting funding. That is not true of African American women. That is not true of Asian women. And I can't remember. Are likely to get funded. And so those issues of diversity also have to address race and the intersection of race and gender.
I would note that again, NIGMS, which is the institute that I'm most familiar with, does analyze these issues. So for example, at Council, we saw a presentation on the early career MIRA awardees broken out by race and gender, right, with respect to the pool of applicants and the pool of people who were formally reviewed and the pool of awardees, right? So they are analyzing that data, and again, from them, that kind of data is available.
I totally agree. I think that, I think the thing that has been very heartening is seeing NIGMS jump into the fray of all of this analysis. I think the thing that really, and I am NIGMS funded, I think the thing that really worries me is that if this is on an IC by IC basis, an institute by institute basis, I'm really concerned about a lot of other people who are doing a lot of really good work, and ICs are not doing similar analysis or not making the same sort of priorities that I see NIGMS doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely, right? And one benefit of the GSI cap, the way it was initially implemented, was it was NIH-wide. And
Yeah.
What's clear about the current implementation of the Next Generation Researcher Initiative is that the source of the funding and how it will be implemented are going to be left to each institute. And I think that's, as Nidhi said, is actually troubling.
Yeah.
With that, I would like to ask this question. Is there evidence that funding cap works? So we have been discussing about NIGMS. So apart from the grant support index, there are also other funding caps that's already in place. And we're also aware that the National Health and Medical Research Council from Australia, they also had successfully implemented funding cap. So could you just comment on whether funding caps will work at all?
Well, so one place that a soft funding cap has been implemented, again, is at NIGMS. They have a policy called the 750K memo. Any investigator who comes in with more than $750,000 in direct costs, and this is from all sources, so it includes HHMI or other big private funding sources. So I actually think it's an even stronger policy, gets extra scrutiny by the members of council. So we sit and look at each one of those grant proposals, and I've seen grant proposals with very meritorious scores get recommended for to not be funded. Again, in part because people have questions about whether someone has the bandwidth to be able to run $1.5 million worth of projects and focus not only on good science but also on training, right? I mean, at some point when your lab size is large enough, I question whether your ability to train the graduate students and postdocs in your lab is sufficient. So that's a place where a soft funding cap has been in place and has been implemented. It's caused a lot of complaints from a very small number of people. But it's one of the reasons the success rate at NIGMS is 29.5% and not 12.5%.
And I also, I have very little data on other places where there might be funding caps. NIGMS is the one that I know the most familiarly, that Mark has sort of gone on about, but has nicely laid out. But I also understand that I think China has a funding agency that also has a funding cap, that you can only get 2 of a specific kind of grant in China. And so I think that there's this understanding that we need to widen the pool of people doing science in the country. And so I think that we want to see data to be able to draw ideas about how policy is working, and until I see that data, and I don't know if I can say anything about whether or not funding caps work. I think NIGMS is the best example of a situation where we've had an unofficial funding cap for I don't know how long. How long is that? $750K?
Well, at least the 3 years that I've been on council.
Yep. And so it would be so. I mean, with the increase in success rate, with all of those things are things that I think you'd want to look at for over the long term and see what that does for the base of the biomedical workforce.
Do you want to add on that, Casey?
Yeah, so I think it was nicely covered. The question of, is there evidence that funding caps work to broaden the base of the biomedical workforce, I think is the most relevant question there. So I think the success rate is helpful, but I don't have the statistics on sort of who NIGMS funds to say anything more than that.
All right.
Well, and one thing that they've tried to focus on is, rather than asking how many grants do they fund, they've started to ask how many unique investigators do we fund.
Just looking at the human capital rather than grant capital.
Yep.
All right. So one of the major oppositions towards grant support index was that it is anti-collaborative and it is anti-training. And in that regard, I would like to ask, what would you say to the comments from a few percentage of people who say that this cap would slow down the rate of scientific progress by limiting the ability of the star labs to do excellent work?
So I guess I want to mention, since you said it was kind of anti-collaboration and anti-training, I think that's an easier thing to chat about first. So I think, with the GSIs, the grant support indexes, specific point values that were assigned to, for instance, training grants and MPI grants, I think there was potentially a reasonable concern around how that policy was precisely defined in a way that could cause problems for people who, I think the policy was designed to prevent an end run around the rules, but I think the challenge of that policy was that being designed to prevent kind of an end run around the grant support rules also primarily harmed people who weren't planning to make an end run around the grant support rules, but who were kind of, have a lot of funding. So yeah, that would be my first thing to push back a little bit against that.
I just note something about that issue, because those were important issues. NIH was listening. By the 20th of May, when we had our NIGMS council meeting, they had already modified the GSI. They'd eliminated training grants as an aspect of funding, because that was absurd, right? I mean, I don't know who was thinking about that. And they'd started to tweak the numbers on collaborative science. I'd also emphasize that the GSI is only one mechanism. And again, in my mind, maybe not the best mechanism, certainly an imperfect mechanism. A dollar cap, like the 750K memo, is in many ways more effective, because it counts all sources of funding, not just GM funding. And then again, I don't care how many collaborative projects you have, but when your dollar amount exceeds $1 million in direct costs, and meanwhile there are a number of investigators whose labs are closing, I'd question whether that's a good investment. Are we shutting down the best science in the best labs? Again, they analyze that very carefully. If you look at the data, which is widely available, you'll see that the data, both from NIH and from other outside people who've looked at that question, suggest that there are diminishing returns when funding exceeds a certain level, and that also reflects itself in terms of impact. They measured impact in a wide variety of different ways, including using a very sophisticated relative citation ratio, and showed that, again, there were many labs with the highest impact who were well under the cap. So of the top 50 most cited labs, 43 were under the cap, and if you use the just total citations, and all of them were under the cap if you use the relative citation ratio. A number of the labs that were among the most highly cited had a single grant, right? Those are the labs that are in danger of closing after failing to renew one time, right? So again, I think the data is out there. I guess maybe I'm in a third string lab, right? I mean, and I run a third string lab. And maybe, Doug Melton and I can have a conversation about that. I remember when Doug was just starting an assistant professor and I was a graduate student in that department, I bet he didn't have a fantastic track record. He didn't have a flock of 50 postdocs working in his lab. How would he compete today in our current funding climate? I'd be curious about that.
I mean, I think I would just say, yeah, I would, sorry, Vinod. I think that I would just say is, I think that I have big problems with this idea that a small subset of well-funded labs are responsible for a lot of the high-impact science that happens. I also think that I have a real problem with this idea that there is a meritocracy currently in how we decide who gets funded and who becomes faculty members and who goes on to generate high-impact science. So when the baseline of all those arguments, I think, is a little shaky, the foundation of those arguments are a little shaky, I have a really hard time having good faith arguments about those things when I'm not sure that the data supports some of those arguments.
Untangling the cause and effect of funding and publications is difficult. I think it's funny that as scientists we spend so much time on our science but so little time on the science of science. Like, we should know the answers to, like, we should have measured these things, but I think there are efforts underway to do it, but it's comfortable to assume that when things are going well, that oh, things are going well, we're doing things right, and whoever's doing best is doing best. But like, understanding why and whether that's because they got a couple grants that just barely ended up under the pay line a few times, and that made their lab larger, and consequently they become more productive because there's more sources of funding. I think the whole science of science aspect needs to be, if you want to argue there are stars, I think you need to have the data to show that, because otherwise it could just be picking winners post hoc, right? If I go and look 10 years ago at the stock market, I can tell you what the best stock would have been to buy. But
I'd encourage people to look up a study that's available online from Katz and Matter at Harvard, right, that looked at that very issue, right? And here's a quote from that. Funding inequality has been rising since 1985, with a small segment of investigators and institutes getting an increasing proportion of funds. The result is investigators who start in the top funding ranks tend to stay there, which results in stasis or lack of mobility. So now, if I summarize that in my own words, right, the rich get richer and the rest of us suffer.
Could someone tweet the link to that under the hashtag?
Yep.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, now there is clear evidence that there's inequality in research funding, and any proposed reforms should never be a perfect solution, but certain changes in the positive direction is always welcome. In that note, I would like to ask this question from Günther Holopeter from Twitter. He asked, what would be benchmarks for a healthy funding climate?
I can't really answer that because I have not been functioning in a healthy funding climate. So, I mean, my memories of a healthy funding climate is grad school, probably. And there were mistakes being made then, too. So maybe Mark can speak. more to.
Again, the benchmark that NIGMS is trying to use is how many investigators are we funding, not how many grants are we providing. And again, when I see that mid-career line dropping, like we saw in the graph that was shown at the beginning of this discussion, that suggests to me that the funding climate isn't healthy. A line that maybe was a little bit more like this for everybody. And just to correct something that you said when you introduced that graph, it's not over 50, it's over 60. Okay, I'm a mid-career scientist. Oh, that actually makes me feel good. I'm not just an old white man. I'm a mid-career scientist, but I'm not quite 60 yet. We're talking about the only people whose funding level is increasing are our most senior colleagues. I think again that looking at that is a good illustration of what a healthy ecosystem would look like. We can't hollow out the middle. If I have a department that only has assistant professors and senior full professors doing funded research, that's not a healthy funding climate.
Yeah, I would say this is the only funding climate I've known. So, you know, I think a funding climate that takes a large number of bets of sufficient size for people to actually do work, yeah, I'd like to see that. So the largest number of bets that are sufficient to carry out a research within the lab.
Okay, so now we have been talking about the reforms and yeah, whichever will be the perfect healthy climate. I was also wanting to ask, what is your personal opinion on how early career researchers could use this situation to advocate for themselves? Because in one of the reasons which Mark was also pointing out was it was not just the opposition, but it's most about how people did not actively advocate in support of grant support index. So.
Yeah, I guess I would say as an untenured assistant professor at one of the schools that has, you know, a strong track record of supporting or opposing funding caps, you know, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do when the CSO of my med school goes to the Council of Councils and is extremely vocal about it. Like, I probably shouldn't say that now, but
don't worry,
but,
he's not listening to this webinar.
But I don't know where that puts you, right? Like, you know, I think, yeah, you can say, well, the early career investigators should have really, you know, fought back, but like, you know, asking an untenured person to oppose the position of their institution seems like a hazardous place to put someone.
Mm-hmm.
About 100 of them did write a letter to the NIH director. People on who were part of the what is it, early career Slack?
Yep.
Right. So it wasn't like nobody spoke up. And just to echo what Casey just said, you know, at that same, I'm standing in the hotel for the May Council meeting, and there's the Vice Chancellor for Research at UNC telling me that I and my colleagues at NIGMS are troublemakers. And that's in order to support probably 5, maybe 6 people at Carolina who would have been affected by the GSI of the several hundred funded researchers here.
I mean, I think what you're seeing here is, and you know, this is the thing. I think what you're seeing here really is that there's I think we've lost sight of what we're supposed to be doing with this money. What we're supposed to, what kind of, I mean, what is the point of being an NIH-funded researcher or a scientist doing research at a faculty at a university? We are training people to be the future. We are doing important research into how things work in biology, and disheartening to see what how we talk about science now, right? And that's and so power dynamics come into it. Who is getting paid, how we're measuring success come into it. And this is the thing I think that's the hardest thing to see right now is that I have trainees in my lab who see that it's not about what we're figuring out. It's about something that is more mercenary in some ways. And I mean, this is going into a completely different direction than what we maybe want to be talking about. And so I think that that's what is happening is that we are losing sight of what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think the culture at the moment is, can be extremely toxic. Like, the idea that you're worth however much NIH money you have is not, I think it doesn't, it's bad from the point of view of like, how we view our peers and colleagues. It's also, I think, bad from the point of view of the long-term health of the enterprise, right? So if like the goal of science becomes to get NIH funding, that's probably the fastest way to make sure there's no more NIH funding for someone to invest in, right? Like we should, if we're not doing it for mission, we're harming the long-term sustainability of research ourselves. It's not some external problem, it's our own.
I mean, I think that all of us would like to be better advocates for this enterprise, but I think it's hard to be the minority, and it's hard to be, getting feedback from people who you think should be on your side and apparently are not on your side.
Yes. Yeah, that's really pointing on.
Sorry to bring it down, dude.
Should be focusing on solving problems rather than inducing competition by providing funding. So now I would like to ask something on how the climate can be made better by tangentially touching upon different modes of funding. For example, there have been several proposals, such as this egalitarian way of equal sharing of funding among researchers. And there were also other ideas floating around where one could do a modified lottery system and so on. So what do you think would be the best way to go forward?
I still like peer review. I still think peer review is important. It would be interesting for me to carefully look at some of those proposals and for NIH to do some modeling for how that would play out. But I still think peer review is important. Peer review allows, I think the peer review process actually does a reasonable job of ranking things, though the bias toward folks who've got resources is a huge problem with that. And the idea that we're going to randomly hand out money, I'm not so wild about that idea.
Yeah, I also don't. I haven't looked at the links that you sent, and so I think I have to do a little bit more research at that. I think I also agree with Mark that I mean, peer review has a lot of problems, and I think that the way that it's set up right now, where there's peer review combined with the advocacy of POs, of program officers, to overcome potentially some of the biases in peer review, I like the way that works. That also has its problems, but I think that and maybe it's my familiarity with the way this works. And so I think I would have to do a little bit more research before I could come out for or against some of the other things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, I guess say it again, I think I would support research into the science of science to help us understand what the best way is to move forward. I don't think I would, if there's sort of pilots to try other approaches, I'd love to see some of that, as long as it's done in a framework where the goal is to gather data, measure effectiveness, and effectiveness kind of broadly based. But without that kind of data, it's hard for me to advocate, moving away from the kind of structure of the system we have now. But I think a stronger emphasis on consideration at the NIH of health of the overall workforce, something that looks a lot more like what the NIGMS is doing, I think is, given where we are right now, I think the most immediate potential way to address some of these challenges.
All right. We have a last question actually from one of the ECAG members, Prachi Avesti. So she says, it feels like we need more investment from the community. There are some vocal people like they are around here, and many others are silent and say privately, only unfunded people are in favor of caps. Many others are not following this as closely. What are your ideas for expanding investment from many that stand to benefit from reform?
I guess I would say I think it's hard to blame people for not speaking up. I mean, you know, if you take if you take community, people who come from, you know, groups that are underrepresented in science, right? Now the levels of risk you're asking people to take on get higher and higher. So, you know, I think it's hard to blame people for not speaking up. I think it would be helpful if, you know, the NIH considered voices equally, as opposed to, you know, I think as Mark mentioned, I think people have a very different, I guess, volume and NIH funding to an investigator seem to, in some way, determine not just how an institution views someone, but how importantly the NIH views someone, and maybe that's an issue.
So I'd encourage people to make their voices known. The first thing that you can do is talk to your colleagues. And the question that I'm asking everyone that I bring into this discussion is the following: is the current system sustainable? Yes or no? If yes, then make your view on that known. If you think the current system is okay, then say that publicly if you're a senior person. If you don't, suggest a solution, and that solution has to be a solution that says where the money will come from and to whom the money will go. So start a discussion with your colleagues. You can write to the NIH director and now to the chairs and the members of the working group on the Next Generation Researcher Initiative. I'll try to tweet the link to the members of that group. They will be meeting in public for the first time, or in person for the first time on November 9th to start to think about these issues. In fact, I'll be making a presentation there. You can also write directly to the NIH director. You can engage your scientific societies. I've been putting a lot of effort into engaging the American Society for Cell Biology, the Genetic Society of America, the Society for Developmental Biology. Those are the societies that I've had the longest association with. ASBMB has spoken out on this issue, right? So that's a way to bring people together. Finally, just to put in a shameless plug, right? There is a petition on change.org, right? That now, let's see what happened in the last 5 minutes, because I actually got to, okay, we're up to 1,459 people who think that the funding cap is good. It would be great to exceed 1,500 by the time I speak to the working group on November 9th, right? So there's lots of ways you can become engaged as an individual.
I would also mention that NGRI working group has a lot of people that, so they have several postdocs on that group, and so that they are people, so if you are an early career researcher who's a postdoc who's concerned about what this means for your career moving forward, I would contact the members of the NGRI that are explicitly there to represent your interests. And so I think that it sounds like Mark is going to provide the Twitter handles and the link for the people who are on NGRI. And so, you know, if you're worried about things like whether or not your IC, if it's not NIGMS, how they're going to implement something like the NGRI, how to the attention to make sure it's not, that there is an NIH-wide policy.
Yeah, I would just point out, I think the cost of speaking up can fall differently on different people. So, yes, you know, I think it's important to consider that.
Yeah. Well, Okay.
Thanks a lot for this insight. Now, in the interest of time, we couldn't follow up all the questions, but the questions will still be followed up on Twitter with the hashtag ECR Wednesday. With that, now I'd like to ask the closing remark from the panelists on, we have been discussing so far about what could be done, but a discussion is not alone enough, but there needs to be some critical actions too. So I would like to ask you, what would be your advice or action points that you would like to agree upon?
I guess I would say, I think there's a lot of evidence that broad-based bets and broad-based investment makes sense. So, I'd say in the absence of strong evidence, it would be hard to me, it's hard to justify sort of an increasing concentration of funding in a small number of labs. But I would strongly support investments in the science of science. So, I think seeing that would be helpful, potentially as a way of justifying that sometimes maybe it is worth making a big bet, but recognizing that that bet's going to come at a high cost to other researchers. So I guess I'd say broaden the base unless there is some extremely strong evidence to the contrary that that's harmful.
I think I would probably entirely agree with Casey that I think that that we need to have more data about what works and what doesn't work, and we can't rely on anecdotal data from successful researchers who might have survivor bias, who might have been successful in this working environment, to be the ones fueling and directing how the NIH decides who's going to get money and who doesn't get money. I agree that we have to do a lot more analysis. The science of science is a great way to put it. And I think that we need to consider, if we are going to continue down this path, what this means to who is involved in science and what kind of science are we generating? What kind of information are we generating about the world that we know?
Well, I think I made my pitch already, my closing pitch, right? But again, I hope people get engaged. I think Casey's point is a great one, but I would point out that, in fact, that is what NIH has been doing, right? And they've gathered quite a bit of data. Continuing to gather that and differentiate between different types of institutions and so on is something I've actually been pushing for on council. So I don't think we're done gathering data, but the folks who are opposed to this at least ought to look at that data before they become entrenched in their opposition.
All right. With that, I'd like to thank all the panelists for providing their insights in this topic. And so we will end the webinar now, but the questions will be followed in Twitter using the hashtag ECR Wednesday. And there will be another webinar on making science reproducible, which will be the next month's webinar. And thank you everyone for joining, and we'll continue our discussions via Twitter.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me as well, and thank you all for joining us.
Yep, exactly. Bye-bye.
Peace.
Bye.